morning, everybody. It's great to have you here. Thank you so much for coming to our fifth Leonard Transportation Center dialogue. Today, I think we have a very important and timely topic looking at the issues of social equity and social justice within the transportation system. We put together a really great panel for you, consisting of Komi Ahise, who is the Executive Director of SCAG, the Southern California Association of Governments, Matt Click, who's the National Congestion Pricing Practice Leader at HNTV. And we also have with you a group of students and previous students who are studying the issues of social equity and sustainability within the Inland Empire, and looking and having students address complex, serious issues within our region as part of a research challenge. We have two students from Cal State San Bernardino, or former students from Cal State San Bernardino, two students from Cal Poly Pomona, and one former student from UCR, all recently graduated. When they applied, of course, they were still students within our systems. And they'll be talking about their research. They haven't, completed the project yet, but really thinking about from their perspective as future leaders and as individuals who will be driving our transportation system again in the near future, really giving their perspective of the system itself. With that, I'd like to welcome and invite Greg Holsizer up to give a welcome from HNTV. Greg?
Thank you, Dr. Collins. Good morning, everyone. I'm really excited today, particularly for this topic. It's a great day. My mood ring is showing purple, which means I'm nice and calm and excited about this topic. So thank you, Dr. Collins, for the opportunity to introduce, or just to say hello on behalf of the 5,000 members of my colleagues of HNTV. I want to welcome everyone who's participating today. This is our third year, and when I think about the topics that we have talked about last 3 years, a lot of engineering, a lot of autonomous connected vehicles, we talked about human resources, but this is our first discussion around equity and social justice. And gone are the days when transportation really focuses only on infrastructure and financing and things like that. So this is very, very timely, and our panelists are well suited to talk with us today about this. Komi, welcome. Glad to have you with us again. I think you spoke during our first year, and glad to have you back. And Matt, my colleague at HNTB, is, I know, going to bring us a lot of expertise. And I'm so excited to hear from the students. Last month, that was probably the highlight, I think, for me of last month, was hearing from the students. So again, welcome on behalf of HNTB, and enjoy this morning.
Thank you very much, Greg. Mm-hmm. At this point, then, I would like to invite up the Dean of the Jack H. Brown College of Business and Public Administration, Lawrence Rose.
Thank you for allowing me to join and welcome everybody here. I really, on behalf of Cal State University, San Bernardino, the Jack H. Brown College of Business and Public Administration, the continued support of the LTC's regional mobility series has just been impressive, especially given the challenges everybody's facing right now. Just getting to work and doing the job, let alone all the other challenges that come from that. So I want to really thank you to take the time joining us to really talk about something that's really, really important, achieving equity and social justice in the transportation system. So today we're going to look at how we can define equity in the transportation sector, discuss how policy design plays an important role in achieving that. You've heard about the guest speakers, so I won't go back over that, but Platinum sponsors, the sponsors of this help us immensely to be successful with the dialogue series, and we are going from success to success. Platinum sponsors include San Bernardino International Airport, thanks to Mike, HNTV Corporation, Greg, right, Carrie, thank you for the continuing support. It's just amazing what we've been able to accomplish together. San Bernardino Valley College, Kenny, thank you for really the support and allowing us to go to another level here. We have the silver sponsors, EXP, Foothill Transit, Lane Construction, HDR, GLA, PMP groups. Thank you all for supporting us and allowing us to deliver on our mission to make a difference in our community. So with that, Kimberly, I'll back to you.
All right, thank you so much. And again, I would like to just reiterate a big thanks to all our sponsors. It's really helped the LTC create these programs as well as support some other important programs that we're doing within the community and thinking about education and the future of transportation and our role as a public university in working with business and the public sector to really make this a better area for everyone. I'd like to also thank all the staff, particularly in Kathleen Ramirez, who does such a great job in getting us all together on these days. Kathleen's a real gem for the LTC, and we love having her be part of this. As well as Danny Chung, who has posted in the chat box for you. If you have any issues, please contact us. As well, if you're interested in becoming a sponsor, there is a link there that can provide additional information on sponsorships of the series. As those who are repeat customers know, this is truly a dialogue. This isn't just a webinar. We do have speakers. They come, they give us their perspectives, their knowledge. They share with us all of the information that they've worked on and they've collected, and they can provide for us. In addition to those experts, we also hear from each of you. We really prepare at the end of the dialogue to have roundtable discussions and breakout rooms. We hope you'll stay with us for those discussions, because it's a very important part of putting together the overall proceedings and the information that comes from this dialogue. It's, again, to provide information, to provide those expert opinions, but also to hear from the community, to find solutions and ways that we can move these conversations forward. So with that, I would like to invite our first speaker, Komi Ahise, up to the podium or his screen to start off our conversation. Komi?
Thanks, Kimberly. Good morning. It's really good to be here, and Greg's always good to see you, and I want to appreciate HNTV's continued support for this regional mobility dialogue series. It's an important conversation, and really appreciate the Leonard Transportation Center's resilience in continuing this dialogue, because I think it's an opportunity to have these conversations very specific to the Inland Empire, and for us at SCAG, there is a lot of value to be had there. So it's really a privilege to join you today. I'm going to share my screen and see if you all can see that. So the first 4 slides are really just if there is, in fact, people out there that have never heard of SCAG, and so we want to make sure we orient you to what SCAG is and what we do just in general. So I'm going to go through the first 4 slides very quickly so we can get to the main topic of discussion on social equity. SCAG is basically Southern California minus San Diego. It's 6 counties. Within the 6 counties, we have 191 cities, a population of over 19 million. And a population that's almost half the size of the state of California, with a very tremendous economy, 1.2 plus trillion. I think we were ravaged by the pandemic and maybe a little lower than that at this point, but that trend in terms of our economy is within the top 20 economies in the world if we were a nation. So it's a very important region from that perspective, one that is chock full of opportunities, and also requires us to pay attention to how those opportunities are made available to all the people. And so the notion of equity, I think, is important. One element of this slide that I think you pay attention to, or you should pay attention to, is the fact that we have about 2/3 of the state's disadvantaged population, communities population. The DACs in the state are identified using a number of different tools like calendar or screen, and we have 67% of those of that population within the SCAG region. So we're overrepresented in that respect. So again, talks about the fact that we have work to do. The mission of SCAG is really, as a regional entity, is to continue to proffer regional solutions for the issues of our day, and one of those is social equity, obviously. Our mission is to continue to have these dialogues like this to enable us to achieve that brighter future that we all envision for Southern California. Our mission speaks to innovation. It speaks to collaboration, which involves some inclusivity. And of course, we advocate on behalf of the region, in other words, to make sure that we have the best of all the options available for our decision makers. As an NPO and a JPA, these are some of the things that we're concerned about. We provide a regional voice. Most of the issues that affect us in the region transcend jurisdictional boundaries, cities and counties, for example. So coming together as a region and having a voice is a little more impactful than if we all individually went to policymakers in Washington and Sacramento. And so we provide that forum for these conversations to develop, one, the regional voice, but also to come up with solutions to attend to our problems that we have in the region. We pride ourselves in being the regional data center, basically, and so we also provide tools for our cities and counties to use to address their planning concerns. So jumping on to the discussion at hand, in July, our regional council passed a resolution on social equity. So that obviously was on the heels of the death of George Floyd and the attendant reckoning on race that we were seeing across the nation. It became very important for us to have a statement that would not only guide our perspective in terms of how we interact, how we think of ourselves as an agency internally, but also how we interact with the rest of our stakeholders, whether it's through our programs or through collaboration or projects or any events that we do. In that resolution, it affirmed our intent to work towards a more fair and just society. The resolution sort of outlined our intentions to incorporate equity and equity awareness in every aspect of the work that we do, like I just said. And then it also encouraged us to continue to build expertise on that as we have further conversation on equity. The resolution also created an equity, sort of an ad hoc special committee on equity. It was called the President's Special Committee on Equity and Social Justice to advise the Regional Council on how we might get input from outside of the agency, from leaders in community, whether it's business or labor or education. We have all of those folks on the committee, and they could have come together to help us identify ways that we can address racial and social disparities internal to the organization, how we also address it as a community in general across the region, and work in partnership with others to continue to close that racial gap. One thing that I think we identified in the conversation that we were having is the fact that the planning profession, planning as a profession, has been part of the problem, quite frankly. maybe unintentionally, in some cases intentionally. When you look at the basis of segregation that we've seen, the evidence of the antecedents of the segregation we see in our society today, we know that the work that we do in planning could continue or may have continued to perpetuate those inequities in society. And so that was going to be one of the things that we also paid attention to. In terms of work that the Social Equity Committee will be doing, this list on this slide sort of gives you an outline of some of that work. Is to, one, let's define equity. What is it? Because I think it could mean different things to different people. But making sure we have a clear definition so that it guides the work that we do and we're not working on the wrong tracks. It sort of would also help provide guidance for the work that we do internally in terms to SCAG, to make sure that we are representing to you all internally. Our staff would represent the population that we serve. It also required us to develop an equity inventory. And really that is to look around and see what are some of the things that are in place, because we had been working on equity for quite a while, but we hadn't really given it the level of attention that it has today. And so looking to see what are some things that are in place and where the gaps are, basically. And so that allows us then to be able to measure it, given the fact that if you have an equity framework developed that has some quantitative and qualitative indicators to it, then you're able to measure the disparities that we have in society. So those are some of the activities that are intended to be part of the work. Some of the priorities that we've set or that we see going forward, and these things are going to be fluid, and as we go through iterations of the discussions on equity, we might adjust the priorities. But it's about, first of all, just identifying, having a conversation and having a real honest conversation, and thus identifying the most need and focusing on how we bring about an affirmative positive change to those areas immediately. Expanding, the stakeholdership that we have in our community. I think we went one step forward in that regard with Connect SoCal, the plan that we just got approved by our board in September. That plan had a lot more investment in community-based organizations than we had ever had. And so that opened us up a little bit, and we think there's more work to do. So how we then use those engagement and that expanded stakeholdership to build a recovery, because we are in the depths of, coming out of the depths of a recession, and that economic recovery, there's an opportunity there we can't allow to go to waste. How do we make that inclusive such that we bring all of our communities together? To do that, you also have to build some capacities at some level. There are a number of our jurisdictions or communities that don't have the capacity to even be at the table, let alone be involved in the conversation. So some of these things we're working on parallel tracks, but for the most part, they link to each other. Building the capacities allows us to have a further discussion and expanding stakeholdership, and expands the engagement, but also makes sure that our recovery is more inclusive. Ensuring that folks have access. I think one of the things that came out of COVID-19 that we've seen very, very starkly is the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on Black and Brown populations and low-income populations. Part of that is access, and the fact that they also are frontline workers for the most part. But we also saw a very disparate impact with regards to broadband. And so thinking of broadband as an infrastructure piece that's an important element, I think is sort of bubbled to the top in the conversations that we're having. So as we move forward, there are a number of projects that we already have in place that are going forward. An example is our Go Human Active Transportation initiative. It's one that we've been at for a while. how do we make sure that as we continue to execute this program, it reaches out even furthermore and takes advantage of the discussion that we're having on equity. So here are some goals that we've sort of retooled for this active transmission program that's been around for several years. It's been one of the more successful programs, but it's one that also speaks to the issue of access that we talked about. To talk about equity and not talk about access, which is access to education, access to jobs, access to health, access to even recreation, I think are all elements of equity that we think this particular program allows us to get to. And so allowing each one of our jurisdictions to be able to compete for state funding, for example, it goes to the issue of capacity building that I talked about earlier on. I'm going to move on to some of the resources that we have that are part of our current adopted plan. In the plan, in our regional transportation plan, we have 2 technical reports that speak very squarely to equity. Again, like I said, the plan is work that we've been doing for 2 years. And so it's not by accident that we have these 2 reports. We actually had been working on equity issues, but then in the last few months, these 2 technical reports came into focus. Of course, environmental justice, where you talk about this notion of making sure that public investments and public policy does not have disparate impacts on different populations. In other words, some people don't benefit overly more than other people who have these benefits. In essence, in the way environmental justice has been practiced, it tends to be a matter of doing no harm. What we're talking about here is to go beyond just doing no harm, to actually make sure that there's affirmative steps taken to ensure that people are actually equally served and they have equal access to all the resources available. The plan itself is a 25-year plan. It goes out to 2045, and it includes a toolbox discussion about how equity would be implemented. The public health technical report talks about health indicators, which is a good basis for assessing the quantitative impact of equity in terms of decisions made in our conversation. The plan also includes a program environmental impact report, which is a CEQA requirement, and it has some mitigation measures that deals also with equity. So combined together, these three documents basically speak to some of the equity work that we are already embarking on that's embedded in our plan.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Kami. Lots of information there. This time I'd like to invite up Matt Click.
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation to speak. I'm absolutely humbled to be asked to speak on this. And, you know, Comey and I didn't talk before this, but it's sort of a lot of his presentation flows right into this. And I will tell you that, you know, what I want to talk about is congestion pricing and equity. So just around social equity, environmental justice inside of the application of congestion pricing as a transportation tool. Because as he already mentioned, you know, there's many versions of it. We could talk horizontal equity, vertical equity, geographic, intergenerational, all that stuff. So my remarks will just focus on equity inside of congestion pricing. We recognize, and we have to start with a fundamental understanding that we have inequity in the existing transportation system today that we're all aware of. And we could talk about that inequity in a few buckets. One, how, you know, transportation funding occurs. I mean, we understand today that through a lot of, you know, existing taxing measures, the way those taxes are, you know, levied, there's a level of regressiveness in that. And that's going to impact people of lower economic burdens, you know, in different ways. Number one, transportation funding. We absolutely know there's inequity in the way that occurs. Number two, traditionally how transportation projects were sited and built, and Comey touched on that a little bit, right? You know, we understand the whole advent of transportation planning, and it's you know, sort of coming of age in the late 1960s was in direct reaction to how the Federal Interstate Program was built, and a lot of it was pushed through lower income and minority neighborhoods, and it was an active way of segregating folks. And you know, the whole transportation planning process evolved sort of out of that really poor history. And then lastly, transportation spending. How are those funds that are collected for the purposes of transportation allocated, and into what populations are they allocated? So we understand that there's, inequity today. And so just to set the table a little bit, when I'm talking about congestion pricing and its benefits, I'm talking about the charging of automobiles for traveling either in a certain corridor or in an urban area, right, during periods of heavy demand. So, what we want to do is we want to use a congestion fee to act as an economic regulator to reduce that congestion and redistribute that transportation demand. Essentially, we want to take a lot of those low priority and discretionary trips out of the peak periods, and we want to push them out to another time period, right? And what that has the potential to do is improve the quality of travel for everybody. And generally one of the primary benefits is to also maximize overall person throughput. Other benefits, it certainly will facilitate transit reliability. It has the potential to reduce VMT overall. And lastly, but important, it's another way to generate revenue for reinvestment in infrastructure. So when we start talking about determining what the right congestion pricing solution might be, we've got to start essentially with a series of questions. So where is our congestion? When does it occur? And how intense is that congestion? And that'll help us understand what sort of congestion pricing program might be applicable. We want to understand how sensitive, certain communities or certain regions public is to price signals. What is their willingness to pay? What is their value of time? And how is that public going to respond to a potential congestion pricing program? Are they just going to change what time they travel? Well, that'll depend on the hours of operation and the hours the congestion pricing program is active. Will they maybe take a different mode of travel? So will there be modal diversion, as we call it? Will they take a different route? Will they try to go around a congestion pricing program that's implemented at a corridor level to try to get around it? Or maybe they'll do what we're doing today. Maybe they're going to just travel electronically. They're going to travel virtually. Or lastly, maybe they won't make that trip at all. And I would just say, as far as the last one, that not making that trip at all, that's probably not something we really want to do. If it makes sense and it's good for people to travel virtually, I think that's great. To the extent we can get people on high occupancy modes, that's wonderful. But when a trip isn't made, a bit of a region's economy is impacted by that. So, ideally we're moving those trips to some other more efficient mode or virtually, but they're still going to occur and lubricate our regional economies. And then as part of then determining that solution, we'll have to, in understanding how the public might respond, we can figure out what is the future transportation system with a congestion pricing program. And then how do we have that conversation around equity so equity can benefit? And when we talk about congestion pricing, quickly I'll say, there are technical challenges. Again, what form of congestion pricing are we going to implement? Is it going to be cordon pricing, corridor-based, an area? What technology might we use? Are we going to use a camera system? Would we use fast-track transponders? How would people be able to pay that fee? So there's all these questions around the infrastructure, and then there's also these questions around how would we explain this new concept to a public that is unfamiliar with it. But in my mind, the technical challenges can all be overcome. We've done this, people understand it, and we can figure that out. I think where the magic is and where the hard work is and the heavy lifting is the community challenges surrounding the congestion pricing. And this is where we really get into the equity part of it. We really need the owners, and when I say owners, I mean the departments of transportations, joint powers authorities, MPOs, self-help counties, whoever's going to be the owner of the congestion pricing program. We need them to work inside with the communities and the stakeholders. And traditionally, we've done a good job of getting stakeholder alignment around transportation programs, interagency coordination, and we've done some community outreach. But we haven't done, and it was great to hear, what Comey was talking about, we haven't done as much as we could to actively reach down and have those conversations with the community. Because what we need to do is ensure that the congestion pricing program isn't going to create an additional burden on lower income folks or other populations that we target. And so what all that means is we need a very extensive program development phase where the owners work very diligently and very hard to get down into the community and develop the actual elements of the program. So work with them to develop it, not just after they've developed it, go by and say, what do you think? But work with them to develop the program, to understand some major drivers. Of course, who is going to be priced as part of the congestion pricing program? How much might that be? And something that we haven't really done before with our community outreach is determine where does that money go. And so I'll quickly talk about the three main buckets of equity and how we look at equity program alternatives inside of congestion pricing. I'll talk about direct equity inside of a program, indirect equity inside of a program, and indirect equity outside of a congestion pricing program. So when we talk about direct equity inside the congestion pricing program, this is also recently be called things like means-based tolling or things like that. But sort of what we're talking about is charging low-income folks or other populations that we identify a congestion pricing fee that is below the market rate. So we're going to provide them some sort of discount and or potentially free traffic. We've got a good implemented example of this in the Virginia DOT low-income toll relief program. That's a picture of my friend Greenlee Johnson announcing the program with Governor McAuliffe there. And what that program was to give low-income folks in a certain geography of 2 cities in Southern Virginia a discount to travel on tolls inside of 2 toll tunnels that bifurcated this historically African-American community. Very successful, about 3,000 people a month benefit from that program. But the lesson in that is you have to balance sort of the ability of the congestion pricing program to still act as that regulator. So we have to ensure that the congestion pricing can still provide, can achieve its congestion reduction targets, while also providing benefits to these populations. And so when you structure and build the program, that's sort of the set of trade-offs you're looking to deal with. That would be direct equity. When we talk about indirect equity inside of a program, the classic example of this is the funding of express or some sort of enhanced transit service inside of the congestion priced. Typically, it's a corridor application, not a corridor like an express lane. This is something we did with I-95 Express in Miami. And a good story there was you had Broward County buses that were coming south. Folks had to get off of that bus. They had to then transfer to a Miami-Dade County bus and travel down into Miami-Dade County where they were working. And we worked with both transit agencies to come up with single seat transit service. And we funded increased headways as part of that. And that is a program that now, I think a month after opening the I-95 Express lanes, we had a 300% increase in transit ridership inside of the corridor. It was subsidized and it got about $1 million a month in subsidy to run that express bus. So when we talk about indirect equity, largely that materializes as enhanced transit service inside the lane. And then indirect equity outside of the program entirely. And this is probably the newest version of how we try to achieve equity inside of implemented congestion pricing. And we don't have a robust list of precedent projects to look at. And that's why you see a lot of words and not any pretty pictures, right? But the idea of indirect equity outside of the program is that we're going to invest congestion pricing generated revenues into transportation or other services. And that could be things like active transportation, such as bike lanes. It could be sidewalk construction. It could be other community priorities. Now, there is a good example of this being implemented right now in Northern Virginia. They have express lanes on the I-66. And the Virginia DOT is working with the Northern Virginia MPO to fund what they're calling a commuter choice program. And essentially what happens is MPOs and cities and counties can become eligible and then they can apply for some of that congestion pricing revenue to fund transportation projects outside of the program itself. And that's something that's just kicking off and getting started. But I would say, I think this is where we're going to see a lot more growth into the future, whereby as we work to get deeper into the community and work with them, we're going to most likely look to allocate revenues generated inside of congestion pricing revenues to other things that might be outside of the area or the corridor. Yeah, so I would say if you were to just take away one slide from my deck, I would say this would be the one when we're talking about public policy and equity relative to congestion pricing. To me, it really comes down to how you set the pricing policies and how you set the revenue policies to determine how equitable and how to achieve and how to essentially get a more equitable transport system with the implementation of pricing. I firmly believe that we can implement congestion pricing and walk away with a transportation system that in fact is more equitable than the one that existed before it. So when we talk about the pricing policy, we're talking about what is charged. Is it a specific corridor? Is it a corridor? Is it an area? Who is charged? 3, who might get those discounts? Who might get those exemptions? How do you go through the process working with the community to define those discounts and exemptions? And then how much? And then on the revenue side, it might sound simple, but it really comes down to where is the money going? What are we going to do with those monies generated by the congestion pricing program? And I would say even more importantly, now and into the future, is who has the say in where that money goes. And I think that's the new area and the new ground that we're all working really hard at. And you know, to answer that, I think that is inside of the communities, it is with the CBOs, and it's to understand, you know, what are we going to do with the revenues? Let me pause there. That's, I think, the end of my deck. And thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Matt. Again, 2 great presentations thus far. And I'm excited to bring on our 3rd sort of group presentation that we have. Representing Cal State San Bernardino, we have Marvin Norman, who was a recent Master's in Public Administration graduate. We have Vanessa Gonzalez, who is a recent graduate of our master's program in social science and globalization. For representing Cal Poly Pomona, we have Christian Lau, who is an undergraduate in urban and regional planning. And we have Nicole Aquino, who is a 4th-year civil engineering student. And then representing UCR in a Bachelor's of Philosophy, we have Oscar Corona joining us. Again, a very diverse, interesting group of students who, again, are going to talk about their work thus far, thinking about the questions of equity and sustainability. And then after their presentation, Comey and Matt, if you could just give some of your reflections on what you've heard, and then from there, we'll have a time for question and answer. Thank you very much. Students, take it away.
So thank you everyone for being here and for joining the conversation about transportation in the region today. We are, as Dr. Collins said, the research group working on this project that intends to define what equity and sustainability means in the context of transportation within the Inland Empire. So we've been, conducting this literature review on the topic of sustainable and equitable transportation, and we've designed a research project that will shed more light on the issues within our region. And what we ultimately seek to do is to define and establish the approaches to equity and sustainability in a way that would encourage community engagement on both of those issues in order to achieve representation. Our work also seeks to recommend solutions that would cater to the future environmental needs of the Inland Empire. So to best assess what equity and sustainability mean in the transportation sector, we've embarked on 3 different sub-projects that allow us to look at these issues from multiple perspectives. The first sub-project would be a weighted scorecard for all the cities in the Inland Empire, and we would take a look at the different policies and programs that each one implements. And the second sub-project is the qualitative analysis of panels that we've hosted from the beginning of the project that featured leaders and experts within the transportation sector of the Inland Empire. And then lastly, we have our third sub-project, which would look at proximity and mobility to essential sites and services in order to assess accessibility to those locations. But the goal of each of these sub-projects is to assess how our different cities are approaching sustainability and equity goals within transportation. But my colleagues will dive into a little bit more detail on each of those sub-projects within this presentation. And ultimately, as we've carried on with this project, we've recognized that equity and sustainability are not mutually exclusive, and they very often do overlap. And the ways in which we define these terms have set the groundwork to this project. So the way we've defined, or the way that sustainability is defined, is as the avoidance of depletion of natural resources in order to maintain an ecological balance. But our definition is more so sustainability in transportation aims to reduce environmental impacts, contribute to economic stability and growth, and sustain the social and cultural values of a given region. Sustainability in transportation in the Inland Empire should strive to serve and meet the needs of present and future residents, while emphasizing upon reducing environmental impacts for the future generations of the region. So ultimately, sustainability should encompass equity as the region moves forward towards a more green transportation. And as we continue to think about how to become more sustainable, we must also focus on environmental justice that ensures that people in underserved and underrepresented areas do not suffer the effects of transportation operations. And Marvin will continue a little bit on to the equity portion for us.
Thank you, Vanessa. So equity has, in our research, we've looked at equity and several different studies on equity, and including, and also we listened to the panels, including some of the panelists who are with us today. And it seems that in what we found, historically, equity has been a bit kind of hard to define, and there are many definitions floating around, which I think is part of the reason that prompted this whole series in the first place. But so the definitions, several of the definitions we found floating around included horizontal equity, and so that's also kind of known as a flat tax. It would be the kind of idea for that. The vertical equity is more popularly known as a progressive tax. Geographic equity, so making sure that, and I know that's a big one in the region here. We heard from some panelists, is that that benefits are coming back to the different communities, proportionate and to how the communities are contributing to the funding as a whole. Demographic equity, and to make sure that the certain demographics are not left out or getting over or getting too much. And political equity, which is making sure that people are getting the same benefits regardless where they are in the political spectrum. And so after looking through all the history and settling and listening to our panelists, we've settled on a definition that centers around, would be kind of centered around, I guess, the demographic type of definition is the most relevant one. And so our definition is that equity in transportation not only aims to not impose a further barrier for those who are underprivileged, but rather seeks to remedy such inequities with active participation from the community in decision making. I know it has the double negative, which in theory could be removed, but we think that even that using a double negative emphasizes what it really is intended to do. And so in the Inland Empire, transportation is a significant contributor to our regional inequities due to the impact that transportation has on health disparities, which are a major issue in some communities, especially around those where the diesel particulates are a big problem. The transportation system also provides or inhibits access to the various opportunities that exist or are being built. And in turn, these are all kind of impacted by the quality of life. So all those together are how we've defined equity. And you see the picture here at the top, we're at the middle right now. This project isn't studying justice yet, but at some point, maybe it will. And so now Nicole will tell you a little bit more about the panel analysis that we conducted.
So one of the research team's sub-projects is conducting a panel analysis. We've been able to attend several panels during the beginning of our research to learn more about the perspectives of different industries on the topic of sustainability and equity in Inland Empire transportation systems. So these panels included professionals from the Distribution Management Association, public transit, transportation and planning agencies, Inland Empire politicians, and other industry leaders. Through these panels, we've been able to further understand the different projects and initiatives that each industry is taking to tackle these issues. So our team will be conducting a qualitative analysis of the textual data that we transcribed from these panels. Our team has transcribed the panels and are working to analyze the content that experts have shared with us regarding sustainability and equity, as well as what those terms mean to them and their work, helping us define the sustainability and equity in the context of this research project, as Vanessa and Marvin had just spoken about. So through these analyses, we're able to better understand the similarities and differences between the takes of different industries on sustainable and equitable transportation systems, since they may look different in each of their lines of work. Through our transcriptions, we've hence seen a likeness and similarities in the positions of different industries on the topics of sustainability, equity, and its many different forms. And there's an overall consensus that our transportation systems do need to be more sustainable and equitable in terms of environmental sustainability, social, and economical as well. And we've used these analyses to help us consider other parts of our project, such as the regional scorecard and an accessibility analysis that will be further discussed in the rest of this presentation, as well as the definition as mentioned previously. We've applied the perspectives of these professionals into these other parts of our project, allowing our research team to consider sustainability and equity from a stance other than our own. Learning from these professionals and from each specific industry allows for a qualitative analysis that considers multiple points of view, as sustainability and equity does look different in each of their work. We're also contacting more organizations in order to get more perspective from more industries, hoping to learn more about the efforts to make the Inland Empire transportation systems more sustainable and equitable for all of its residents. Next, Christian will be talking about one of our other sub-projects, the regional scorecard.
Thank you, Nicole. Right here is one of our other sub-projects, regional scorecard. As the panel is more of a qualitative analysis, the scorecard would be more of a quantitative analysis. This scorecard is one of our analytical tools that will help us analyze the jurisdictions in the Inland Empire. That's also including the LA County cities of Pomona, Claremont, and Laverne because of where they are geographically within the Inland Empire limits. We developed a criteria to see if these jurisdictions are looking into the goals of equity and sustainability. And also like in terms of like what are they doing within transportation as well. It is still a work in progress, but we decided to accumulate it with the point system to better understand which cities are tackling these goals of both equity and sustainability for the region. We decided to split into 3 criteria. The 3 criteria is, as I mentioned before, equity, sustainability, and transportation. With the criteria of equity, we will check to see, for example, if there are like the differences between homeowners versus renters. Do they have a low percentage of population that are in poverty, or just like the conditions of a community's public health, like things from transportation that has affected them in regards to like the not social behaviors, but more of the social surroundings and the built environment. Also, like if there are any SB 535 disadvantaged communities that we can identify within these jurisdictions. Most importantly, we'll analyze if there's an environmental justice element within their general plans. General plans are documents for the city that they plan to do for what they plan to do for the next 40 years. So for us, it's really important to understand if they're going to have SB 1000 or environmental justice implemented into their general plans. For sustainability, some examples that we're looking for to see if there's a plan to create for complete streets. Also, like if they have anything in terms of relation with habitat mitigation plans, or if they have a plans for further infrastructure or public policies to create infrastructure with electrical vehicles. Lastly, when we analyze the elements in the transportation criteria, there is a plan, double checking if there's a plan to like create policies or plans within active transportation, safe routes to school, or if they're doing any partnerships to within the circulation of how the circulation is going to be within the cities. Also, like, are they doing any trip reduction plans that may have, or what policies do they have regarding transportation safety, for example, for the people, like for bicyclists and pedestrians? Like, are they going to avoid, what is their plan to mitigate just the safety or to reduce car collisions, for example? So we're excited to see what we find and see this work in progress. I'd like to introduce Oscar to our third sub-project into the accessibility assessment.
Thank you, Tristan. So last but not least is the accessibility assessment, which is meant to allow us to have a better understanding of what areas have more access to jobs, services, and goods. This assessment works by first using GIS data to map all the desirable destinations for people in the region. We decided that these destinations will be job opportunities, health centers, educational locations, both lower and higher ed, recreational spaces, and last, grocery shopping. All these 5 destinations represent things that we believe are needed for people to have a better quality of life. When those are mapped, then we will use GPS data to have an estimate of the amount of these places that can be reached within a certain travel time, for different modes of transportation. For the travel time of cars, we will be using 30 minutes for jobs and higher ed, and 15 minutes for health and recreation. For public transportation and biking, we're going to be using 1 hour for jobs and higher ed, and 30 minutes for health, recreation, shopping, and lower ed. It is worth noting that research of this kind has mostly focused on job accessibility. The image on the right, for example, shows job accessibility in the San Diego area. However, we believe that job accessibility is only one of the many needs that an equitable transportation system should meet. For this reason, we have included the other 4 destinations which more accurately represent the different needs for people in the area. We hope that this project will help us understand what areas are most underserved when it comes to accessibility to these key destinations, which should be a good starting point for both research and implementation of solutions. And with that, those are all of our sub-projects and research protocol. We can wait to get back to you with the results, and we hope that you are all as excited as we are for these projects.
Thank you so much. That was fabulous. It was really great to hear your progress thus far. And as they are just like, they're, you know, let's see, a third of the way through, they'll be continue to work. This is a 9-month-long project. They'll be working into spring of next year. And we were hoping to, well, we'll just have to see, things have been delayed, but submitting a paper on their work to TRB in the future. And if, you know, they're available to travel to Washington, D.C. to present our findings in the future. With that, I would like to invite Koe and Matt, if you'd like to give just a bit of reflection, some ideas for our students, and we can have a conversation about everything that we've heard. I know it's been a lot of information, and I just wanted to remind everyone that all of this will be up on the LTC website in the near future. So the full recording of the session, as well as proceedings, which you can access soon. All right, with that, please, Koe, Matt.
Sure, I'll start. First of all, thank you, Dr. Collins, for this, enabling this. I know we had this conversation so many months ago. It's good to begin to see some of the outcomes of the work that the Leonard Center is doing, and wow, what a tremendous amount of work already done. You say they're only a third of the way through. One of the things I just want to appreciate a number of things that came out of the presentations so far. The work on defining equity, because it's I think that's probably one of the more important things that we need to get our arms around, because if we're going to solve this huge societal problem, we have to all have a common sense of what we're trying to solve. Otherwise, we're going to be working at cross purposes. So I appreciate the attempt to put a definition to it. obviously one way to think about equity is to make sure that we don't continue to make disparities of public policy and projects. I think that's a good element of the definition. But also more important, maybe equally important, is to look back and see how we correct the disparities of the past, the inequities that have been created in the past. So I think bringing those together in the definition, I know you were struggling with the double negatives, Marvin, but I think it's a beginning conversation. And I look what I've told our staff in discussing the notion of social equity is it's not a time limited project. It's not something we need to get done by June of next year. This is a forever conversation. So I think being open to the fluid nature of the conversation as you bring stakeholders to the table, as you've seen, the different folks you talk to have different takes and interest in equity. So I think the definition will continue to move forward. I also appreciate the way you've looked at it. You have the qualitative and the quantitative, and I think that's excellent because we found ourselves doing the same thing. There are some things that lend themselves to very clear numbers. You know, when you talk about wealth gap, that's a very set quantitative metric that you can then begin to figure a way to address. But then there are some nuances in equities in terms of the disparate impact of programs that you can't really put a number on. So having those conversations on those two levels, I think, are important. And then finally, I think addressing those three elements of access to opportunities, looking at health disparities, and also attending to quality of life, which is a little more squishy because quality of life it's a matter of definition. There's a squishy definition there because it really depends on who you're talking to and how they assess their quality of life. So, but definitely access, and I appreciate what you looked at in terms of what's a time access, what's a time, I'm looking for a word here that I'm not getting, but how much time does it take for different parts of the population to access opportunities, and putting the benchmark to that allows us to begin to fully define and understand how we have disparate impacts on communities. Then last thing I would just say, just to kind of wrap it up, you know, when we talk about solving for equity and you take the issue of wealth, the wealth gap, for example, and oftentimes in the past, we've always said, well, it's if the lower income population or the minority populations have access to education, that would close the wealth gap. We know that's not true, because we know that there is a mobility and accessibility issue that even with education, you might not be able to get to those jobs. And of course, there's some historical element to that. So when you start to take the totality of your work, you can begin to see that the notion of equity is very complex and we need to be very deliberate, intentional in how we approach it. Well, with that, I'll pass it to Matt.
Yeah, boy, that was a lot. And I thought of a few things. The first thing I thought of is that I don't think I'm smart enough to get into grad school anymore. So congratulations to you guys. I'm glad I'm out. And for a third of the way through, you're doing remarkable work. I'll also tell you, I'm a standing member of the Managed Lanes Committee at TRB. And if you want to do a poster presentation or a paper that would come through and have a pricing element, I'd love to work with you to help support that. And, you know, TRB, as in 21 is going to be virtual, but I don't know your exact timeline, but if there's a way to, get you there in person in 22 or something, but I'd love to help you with that. I thought about this, and I spent a long time on the public sector side in policy, and for about the last dozen years, I've been back in consulting. So as I was listening to you guys, I tried to think about this, like if this was a study that I was hired to do by a client, right? So that was, and I really wrote down a lot of questions that I had just to frame things up. So maybe the best thing I can do to provide feedback to you is, as I was listening, I was writing down, the questions and what was engendered, what you were making me think about and what I thought you might want answers to. And so I'll just go through those sort of in a stream of consciousness. I can always type these up later and get them to the right people. But that was the framework I was trying to think about. And I thought about things like, do you have a framework on how you would analyze all of those 3 sub-projects together? Do you have a master sort of framework for that? I thought about how would you, and again, some of this might be out of the scope of your research. So, take it for what it is. But I thought, how would you end up, and these are actually probably in reverse order, but I was thinking, how would you get decision makers aligned around that equity framework for implementation? With regards to some of the quantitative inside of equity and sustainability, I was thinking about how would you measure those things, right? And I think you, in the later presentation, started talking about that with some of the GIS analysis. But often, one of the biggest constraints we have in trying to solve for something is what sort of available data is. So how do you start out with these concepts of what you're trying to achieve and find data to represent that, whether it be what is quantitative or qualitative? And I am a firm believer as a social scientist and a city planner that there's nothing wrong with qualitative data. And I think over the last 25, 30 years, we tried to quantify everything, and that's where sort of the whole canon of social science is gone. But I think there's nothing wrong with very good sound qualitative research. But essentially, one of the things that we learn lots of times when we're trying to study things is what exists, what can we measure and what can't we measure. I was thinking about what sort of land use policies are all of you considering into the future and its interaction with the transportation network, and how changes to land use through an equity lens will also help with sustainability and equity. Similarly to, is there data to measure some of these things? Are there tools? Are there tools that exist? So are there transportation tools, operational models, demand models, activity-based models? Would you want to come up with, very good, robust spreadsheet models to try to test for some of this? And a lot of this stuff inside of, and again, I'm going to be biased to congestion pricing and what I work in, but inside of that, there are traditional modeling applications, obviously for traffic, and then there are traffic and revenue applications of demand forecasting for traditional tolls. But when we get into the dynamic nature of congestion pricing, there are people working to develop those things, but trying to accurately forecast what's happening in the human psychology around decision-making relative to pricing signals is tough. So we end up developing a lot of that stuff inside of models, inside of very robust spreadsheet models. And then with sustainability, because again, this is one that I was wondering about how much of that would be qualitative analysis and how much of that would be quantitative. So I was thinking about, we want to set the table. We want to say, this is the base case. This is where we are. But, what are we going to go to then go present solutions and proof out and test those solutions and get alignment around those solutions inside of equity and sustainability. I'm just looking at my notes. And that's about it. I thought it was great. And yeah, let me pause there so we can get the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Comey, Matt. I think it's very helpful. It kind of sets us up as well to have a bit of a conversation about everything that we've heard. Matt, if you could type those up, that would be great. You have a great list of questions, some that I think can be done within our time frame, and some that I think we need to set up for future research within the center. With that, I'd like to open it up to see if there's any questions in the room.
I had a question.
Any questions? Yes, please, Josh.
So my question was for Matt, related to the study in Florida about the congestion pricing and then transit service. have there been any discussions about a reduction in fare from some of the revenue of the congestion pricing for transit service?
So the public buses are not charged the congestion fee at all. If that's is that the question, Josh?
No. So it's
okay. Sorry.
Can people ride the bus with a less fare or no fare based on the revenue from the congestion pricing? So did they take the revenue of the congestion pricing, give it to the transit agency, and they can use that for added service, and then possibly, little to no fare?
Yep. So it's half yes to that, and so they didn't run the service for absolutely free. But as I recall, and I'd have to sort of Google fact check the numbers to give you 100% accuracy, right? If you were to fact check me Politico style. But as I recall, it was about a $2 general fare, and that fare was not raised. And then the vast majority of the revenues coming from the congestion pricing program was to acquire more fleet, more buses, to be able to have the buses to run inside of them. We never got to the point of then actually, and I know this wasn't exactly your question, but we didn't get to the point of looking at charging no fare at all for the service or having some sort of means-based fare test. Really what we did there is we just provided more transit service in the corridor. And that project goes back to, that was, well, geez, it predates that. It was basically, well, let's see, it started in 04, basically like 07. So, this is 10, 12 years ago, and the thinking has really moved. But back then, that was groundbreaking. Yeah.
Thank you.
Are there other questions?
Kimberly, this is Greg. I have a question for Comey.
Sure.
Comey, since much of my life revolves around express lanes, and in California, we have express lanes popping up all over. AB 194 was the law that was passed that was the blueprint or the recipe for new express lanes coming online, the various MPOs and planning agencies and things like that. To date, that I know of, we only have one, which is LA Metro, that has a low income or any type of equity type, social equity type program. Could you see the time when either for Southern California as a regional advocate, SCAG, or on a statewide basis, there would be an advocate to maybe amend AB 194 or other legislation that would require any new express lanes or ones that want to expand to include some type of social equity, environmental justice, low-income program?
Excellent question. Actually, I think it ties to Josh's question as well. We're in the process of building out what we consider to be the regional network on express lanes in Southern California. It's not as quick as we had hoped it would be, and AB 194, like you alluded to, Greg, I think is an important watermark in the process. I'm always leery of new legislation or new mandate from Sacramento or Washington, for that matter. I think within the framework of AB 194, we have the capacities in our region to put the equity framework in place, just like LA Metro did. They didn't have to wait for any new legislation. So, and I understand, and I know that the other managed lane entities, the commissions they have that in mind too. Going to I think the question that Josh raised about could you offset fares with proceeds from managed lanes? I think you could. I think it's a matter of the numbers. How do they ship out? Right now, LA Metro is also considering going fareless, which means the entire system, if in fact implemented, you wouldn't have any fare on the entire system. I think at its peak, they were boarding about 1.2 million passengers a day, and so that would be the number that goes with the fareless process. But what's important to note in that conversation is to kind of figure out, well, how much fares do they collect right now? Well, how how much of their revenue is made up of fares, and it's about 13%, somewhere in there, as far as Metro is concerned. So it's an easier conversation to have when you're doing away with 13% of your revenue than if you're doing away with 50% of your revenue. And so it's going to vary from, I guess the point I'm making, it's going to vary from property to property, how you implement social equity on the fare scale, for example. But I think, to the extent possible, when we start to grow the network, and of course with the conversation we're having, developing the equity framework that the students just put forward, that SCAG's working on, and I know the CTCs are also working on, it would be a matter of just implementation to find the right level for the social equity implication for express lanes on the transit side. I think what AB 194 did very clearly, that I think is helpful, that allows us to take this forward, is it does say, understanding that there's financing involved, as you know, Greg, with this managed lanes. There's money borrowed, that money needs to be paid back, and AB 194 puts in there that once you have paid your debtors, whatever is left, that excess revenue has to be spent in the corridor. And one of the primary objects of that expenditure is going to be transit. It's going to be active transportation. And I think there is more to social equity from those proceeds, where there is excess revenue as we go forward.
Thank you.
We have a question in the chat. Is how user psychology affect congestion pricing acceptability? So the user of it, and the thoughts, many have said, why do I have to pay again to get on a toll road when my taxes have already built the system? So really the complexities of the financing and understanding the structure of public financing. How do we deal with that issue?
Yeah, I'll start. Comey, would you like me to start?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so it's a great question, and it's sort of like a congestion pricing project. Once you've done one, because you really got to contextualize it to the local corridor community and the history around it. I will just start with like the tax question. We get this a lot. My taxes have paid for that interstate. And I say, no, not really. Your grandmother's taxes paid for that interstate, but yours didn't. We've been borrowing from the general fund of the Federal Reserve for some time now. There's nothing that's free. And then of course, we all on this call certainly know about, the purchasing power of motor fuel based tax, or even sales tax measures, the increased CAFE standards, the increased electrification of the fleet, all of those sorts of things that are really good, right? They're good for sustainability, they're good for air quality, but they're not good for funding. So, I think how that is addressed depends on the type of congestion pricing project. When we started out with these, the vast majority of these, now with the exception of the first, which Greg actually worked on, SR 91, but with the exception of that one, we sort of had this 10 or 12 year period where the vast majority of express lanes, they were where we took underutilized existing high occupancy vehicle lanes and we sold off excess capacity to generate a little bit of revenue and fill the lane. And that was sort of express lane 101, right? And over in Europe, they were starting to play around with cordon pricing, and Singapore's been doing it since the 70s. But domestically inside of the US, this first phase was of these really low budget, easy, we'll put up a couple of toll gantries and we'll basically allow single occupant vehicles a legal way to get into this underutilized lane, and we'll generate a little revenue. And that changed by where we were in the country, right? California has had a long history of very successful HOV lanes that were actually facing degradation, meaning they were filling up. So it's a little bit different conversation in California, or for instance, in Washington, DC. Honestly, if you look at the rest of the US, Florida, parts of Illinois, Texas, other places where they rolled out HOV lanes in the 70s and 80s, they were largely underutilized, and quite frankly, they weren't even enforced by most local jurisdictions. But so when we were trying to do that, we were just taking existing capacity and trying to let people have a legal way to buy into that. And so I don't know about the exact psychology of it, but our communications and marketing around it and the way we talked about it with the public is we're not taking anything away from you. You have absolutely every way to legally access this. We're only allowing more people to utilize it legally. And so that was the way we talked about it. And then we got into what I'll call sort of 2.0 express lanes, where we're going to add capacity, we're going to expand out. And these might be private concessionaire involvement, they might not, but we're gonna add something new. And there, I think it's a little bit simpler because we were basically saying, you would have never got this capacity through tax funding. The monies were not there, they did not exist. And if it weren't for a bond sale, we weren't going to build a big thing like the 395 express lanes or the 495, let's say Northern Virginia going into Washington, D.C. So there, I think it was easier. And part of that psychology was like, you're paying for premium service, everybody on here knows, if you want a higher end data plan, or if you want cable television, you can pull television out of the sky for free, if you want to, or you can go, but if you want, premium streaming, you're going to pay for it. And we sort of use those sort of pay to play principles. And then if we get into sort of the really newer stuff domestically around cordon pricing, the way we talk about that is it gets back to, I think, a little bit of something I said about what we do with the revenue and how we talk about that. And those programs, they don't always have to be about the same thing. For instance, when we worked on Fix New York City, we walked in, we sat down with Governor Cuomo's staff, and we started to say, okay, is this about sustainability? What are we trying to achieve with congestion pricing? Why do you want to get into this business? And they said $863 million a year. A very New York thing to say. It was about revenue. They weren't hiding it, and they needed $863 million a year gross to fix the MTA subway. This was pre-COVID and pre all of that. If you go and look at what Washington, D.C. is doing right now and studying congestion pricing, or San Francisco, it's much more about equity, and it's much more about environmental sustainability. So to sort of wrap up a really long-winded answer, the psychology is you talk about what are all the new things you're getting with this new system, and you could also talk about the fact that the existing system is just not manageable. You've all heard, oh, you can't build your way out of congestion. And I think that's fairly true in practice. Now, theoretically, you could build your way out of congestion. The question I would ask people is, would you really want to live in a world that looked like that? Would you really want to live in a world where all of your interstates were built to handle the 25th busiest hour of the year? I mean, I don't think that's a sort of like urban form or things we want to, get around. But the psychology is tough, but I think how you engage and talk about your congestion pricing program to the public around what its vision is, what the goals are, and then specifically how the revenues are going to be utilized will go a long way. Let me pause there. That was a lot.
Let me just add, I know one of my board members, Jim Overhill, has his hand up, but let me just add real quickly to what Matt said, because I think you covered it, Matt. We did a study at SCAG, and I want to, because most of what you talked about, Matt, focused on the interstate and the freeways. That's what people tend to think of when they think of congestion pricing. And you were also talking about cordon pricing. I think with technology today, we have the capacity to actually also price on the arterial system within cities. And that was the essence of our study a couple of years ago at SCAG, the GO Zone study on the west side. The outcomes of that, it speaks to the psychology question that's being asked. The outcomes of that was, there was that same sense of why do I have to pay for it twice? And folks have to be reminded that there are a lot of utilities that you pay premium for. If I start to run my dishwasher and my washing machine dryers now, people will think I'm stupid, right? Because the rates are a little higher now. And we don't think of transportation the same way. If you got on the freeway or any road system at 12 midnight, it's wide open. You don't need to price it. But everybody wants to get on at 7 a.m. How do we make sure that the people that are using at 7 a.m. really must use it at 7 a.m.? I think that's the essence of the psychology of congestion pricing. And that's what you're trying to do, is to give people that sense of, you know what, I don't need to make my trip at 7 a.m. and pay $5. Because if I wait till 10, I don't have to pay anything, and I can still make what I need to, I can still get done what I need to get done. So that's what congestion pricing plays into. Real quickly, when we did our study, what it showed was it did, in fact, when you did the cordon pricing, I think we had like 57 cordon points that you could be priced going into the West Side, in and out of the West Side. What it showed was it did, in fact, reduce congestion appreciably, but it also increased transit ridership, and it generated revenue. And so it was really instructive to look at that. And so in our regional plan going out to 2045, we have congestion pricing as an important element of how we in fact get to some measure of sustainability in terms of reducing greenhouse gases. And we're not talking about just pricing on the highway system, freeway system, but pricing in general across congested arterials. Where it's relevant, obviously, you need to have those conversations locally to get to the point of implementing those programs.
Thank you, Kwame. Councilman Mulvihill?
Last year, before the COVID discussion really seemed to take over so much of the planning, there was a number of studies that came out to indicate that transit ridership was down as compared to automobiles. I'm just wondering, how does that fit into this discussion of equity and pricing and so forth? And does it?
Oh, it absolutely does. And I'll just quickly start, and Matt can step in. I think it does, because first of all, when you look at the population that predominantly takes transit, it's low income and folks of color. So there is an equity aspect to the idea of transit. When transit ridership was falling, there were folks that just had no choice, but they had to be on transit. But there were also, one of the things that we found in that study that we did with UCLA, also about 2 years ago, was one of the main reasons transit ridership was falling, at least in our region, was the low income folks had access to buying vehicles. The loans were cheaper, auto loans were cheaper. There was just ability to be able to get into a car became so much more readily available to them, and they took it because it was their way of guaranteeing getting to jobs, for example, and also allowing folks to move further away and not have to rely on transit. And so it had that effect. However, there's still folks that take transit. I think one of the misunderstood aspects of transit sometimes is, and just transportation planning in general, we spend a lot of time focused on the peak periods. We design everything. All of our solutions are designed for the peak periods, when in fact, most of our mobility in the course of the day occurs outside of the peak period. Most of the travel that we have is outside the peak period. And so we also found that one of the problems with transit is we load up a number of buses and a number of routes to serve the peak periods, which is typically commute travel. And then during the day, when most of the transit dependents are really using transit, we don't have the same level of service. And thirdly, our roads were congested, and we put transit on those arterials. And so if I have a car in the house, chances are I'm not taking transit, was one of the outcomes of the study, because I'd rather just jump in my car and go and be in the same congestion than sit on the bus and be in the same congestion. So there were things that were working against transit. And so as we think of equity, and which is why it's important. I think it was Oscar that was showing that that graphic about access for different populations. I imagine you're using census blocks, you know, access to jobs, access to recreation and things like that, and keep providing some benchmarks for not taking more than 30 minutes to get from, you know, to higher ed from your home, whether it's on transit. Creating that kind of benchmark, I think, is an important element of looking at equity and making sure transit is sustained. So transit has to be a part of our sustainability program, because it's about having mobility choices, and not everybody can drive. Quite frankly, not everybody should drive. And so having transit more viable, I think it's an important element of that. And so we need to figure out a way to get around the transit ridership issue. And, you know, one of the last things is, you know, one of the reasons it was important to pay attention to the ridership drop is because of revenues. It's like, you know, the fare box was falling on transit side. If the fare box doesn't feature a whole lot in transit revenues in the first place, then maybe we're not so focused on the revenues and we're spending more time looking at how we augment the system.
Yeah, I mean, Comey, I don't have much to add to that. I will say this, you know, we're working, you know, on implementing an equity program right now up in the Bay Area. And, you know, I laid out for you all sort of like in a way, our, you know, these three buckets of thinking about, you know, equity inside of congestion pricing, sort of, you know, a direct version and a couple indirect versions. And yeah, for the vast majority of the lifespan of congestion pricing in the US, the subsidizing of transit or enhancing transit has been the marker by which we've said, oh, we're being equitable, we're doing our very best. And it's and that was great, and it was a great start, but we've got to evolve and do more and be better about it. And I think the COVID crisis and everything that Comey's already talked about has highlighted that more. So even though I laid out, you know, three potential options for that, you know, we might actually see a hybrid, right? We might actually see where we take a percentage of that revenue, we fund transit, or depending on the sort of revenue generated, maybe we don't get into that business, right? That business already exists, but maybe we provide some sort of transit card, some transit fare cards to folks to utilize inside of various transit networks as they see fit. And maybe we do that with a combination of giving people relief inside of the lane as they do look to, you know, use automobiles more. And you know, in those communities, those lower income communities tend to share them a lot. But, you know, maybe we do some sort of hybrid where it's fares passes, it could be active transportation, and we could say, hey, you know, you're going to get some level of discount. I'm making this up right now, you know, because this is an ongoing project, so we don't have any solutions and haven't vet anything, but maybe we would say you're going to get 3 trips a month or a trip a week, because sometimes transit isn't going to serve your needs. You're going to need to get somewhere and utilize that facility. On the Virginia DOT program that I mentioned briefly, one of the things we did is, because we had a constrained amount of money, so we couldn't go over a certain budget annually. So we qualified folks based on their income, and then we secondarily qualified them on their geography. We said, if you live in Washington, D.C. and make little money, you know, these facilities are 2 hours away. You shouldn't really be able to come on down and get a free ride, right? It's not, you weren't bifurcated. Your communities weren't bifurcated by these tunnels and your access to healthcare. So we said, 1, you've got to income qualify. 2, you've got to geographically qualify. And then 3rd, we said you have to qualify based on frequency. And I'm not saying that's the right approach for all programs. I'm saying that's an example where we customized that for that community, for that need. And the reason being is we had to make tough choices, and we decided to take those limited resources and focus on the working poor. And so we said, if you utilize those tunnels 8 or more times a month, all of your tolls will be half off. And then the other thing that happened is those communities didn't have access to those transponders because they didn't have $25 in the bank. So we got rid of that. So there was no barrier for them having a transponder. And this private sector company was charging them almost double if they had to take a picture of their license plate. So just by virtue of them getting the transponder for free, their tolls were going to be cut in half. And then if they used the facility 8 or more times a month, they would get another half of that off. But that's sort of an example where, you know, you've really got to customize it, you know, one at a time. But I think all that to say, I think we're going to see sort of blended and hybrid solutions around equity as we move forward, you know, by various modes.
Thanks so much. Carrie Witt has a very quick question.
Matt, you were going down the path, and Kome, you briefly touched on it. I think one of the things that we are hearing is that or starting to hear is that the default has always been to subsidize transit. And that's kind of the easy way to declare victory over your equity issues, and you know, maybe throwing more transit at the poor people is not ultimately the answer, because as Matt pointed out, not everyone can use transit. There are people who have to drive, and so I think it's good that you're thinking in terms of equity solutions, or in terms of hybrid solutions that allow people to use cards. I was interested in just some thoughts, Kome, at the beginning. You mentioned broadband in this whole conversation, and it seems to me that COVID has really almost created a whole new inequity, a whole new disadvantaged population that really didn't exist before, and that is people who can't work from home. So now you have this new divide between people who are able to make the decision to work at home and people who just can't work at home. And I wonder about your thoughts of using some excess revenue to enhance broadband capability to allow more people to work from home and be off the highways altogether.
Absolutely. I don't know that it created a new level of disparity. I think it's always been there. The work to close the digital divide has been going on for decades now. What COVID-19 did was to show exactly how bad it is, or it could be. You know, folks can't work from home for different reasons. Some jobs just don't lend themselves to being worked from at home. You know, you got to show up at the factory, you got to show up at the hospital, and so you can't do that from home. There are some statutory limitations as well that we're working on to change, where there's some, you know, there's a limitation on what counts as full-time work, and working from home sort of changes some of those definitions that we need to make sure statute don't limit folks that can work from home because of those limitations. So that's one. There's some statutory fix that we need to have. But the digital divide itself, making sure, and the governor just signed an executive order, N7320, that speaks to that. And by the end of the year, there should be a strategic plan on broadband for the state, where the governor is establishing some benchmark speeds of, you know, 100 MBs, I guess they call it, because broadband is different from broadband, as you know. And so now that we are learning from home, now that we're engaged in healthcare from home, broadband is no longer just been nice to have high-speed internet. That's not just the thing. I think everybody now, kind of like electricity and water being piped into your homes, now broadband's become an essential piece of infrastructure. And we have a group working right now in Southern California on this particular initiative to bring all the resources. I think that's the point you're making. It's not just about, you know, just subsidizing transit. It's how do we bring resources to the table to make sure that every home has broadband access. When we looked, we have a study going on right now with Ernst & Young, looking to monetize the process of building broadband, because the public sector just couldn't do it. And so how do we bring the private sector or private equity to help us close the gap? You got to monetize it, and that was the genesis of our study. Now it's kind of grown into looking to see what other public funds are available. So now the discussion of broadband, we're implicating healthcare dollars and education dollars beyond just transportation dollars. So because this one particular piece of infrastructure now serves multiple objectives beyond just access to jobs. So that's the interesting conversation we're having, and trying to see where we could put some CARES Act money that looks to expire in the next few months to making that happen is one. Two is to make sure that we allow our ISPs easier access to being able to build the infrastructure through our communities. In that case, with 197 jurisdictions, if the ISP has to go through each one of our jurisdictions and it's a different form and a different requirement, it's not going to happen. And so making sure we have some clarity on the public side in how we address that, I think it's the second biggest element of the conversation of solving for broadband. But in fact, yeah, broadband is as an important element of social equity going forward, without question.
All right, thank you so much. I have many things I'd like to say, but I'm going to move us into our breakout rooms. I'll say some of it there. We have about 10 minutes, so we'll come back here at 9:50 and report out from those breakout rooms. I hope you'll stay with us as we really talk about what we heard, what we didn't hear, and how do we move this conversation forward. I think for me, and one of the things that we talked about is really the need to, define the key roles as we move forward of the public and the private, and really think about these two important entities. And again, community-based organizations are there, but the two sort of, drivers of it in some way is really coming from that public and the private sphere. From my perspective, again, I teach public administration. I'm a student of public administration, watching how our government has changed over time. I think we need to really think of how we fund government and how we get money into the public coffers, so that it's not just always doing it on the cheapest, but doing it so that it's the best for our communities, because we can't rely completely on the private sector. Though it's an important part of the equation, they have their realm and the public has its realm. And so as a country, we need to really think about and re-embrace what it is to be in the public sector as we move forward on these equity and sustainability conversations in particular. And from there as well, thinking about how do we get the best bang for the buck in our infrastructure build out, and how we can make sure that some of the rules that are happening with the build out of infrastructure at the state level go into the local level, such as combining broadband and combining other infrastructure in the development or in the redevelopment of highways and streets. So those were some of the main pieces that we talked about, as well as transit and the future of transit, but within this time, because shared mobility is so important as we look at equity and then the future of mobility within this region. Okay, I'm sorry. Moving forward, group 2, quickly.
Right. Yeah, kind of quick summary. Really we talked about what to do with the excess tax. I think to lead into the discussion, what Carrie was mentioning was a really interesting discussion about how to allocate some of those revenue, and transit is maybe the first, but not always the best use for that. The other part was kind of one of the ideas we didn't hear was there's different organizations working on the equity framework, and so somehow connecting everyone on the state level. So maybe some of the things that COME is doing with some of the Bay Area, there's other different kind of cities working together. So working on the state level to kind of build some synergies of different discussions and things going on. And the other thing too is I think for Southern California, we're still so much a car-centric focus that it's what people do when they have a little bit extra money is go buy a car instead of kind of use public transportation.
All right, thank you so much, Josh. Group 3.
So we have 3 questions. Is there anything unexpected or new that we heard? Anything that we expected to hear but didn't hear? And what do we need to do to keep the conversation going? So in the first question, the unexpected and new category really kind of was broadband, and the idea that you really need to be a utility, not just a luxury that we all nicely use to watch YouTube videos when we're bored, but that is really a necessity for communities just to be able to be part of the society in this time. But at the same time, we also recognize that the conversation around how remote working is creating maybe a divide, and is it creating a divide or is it improving equity, especially in the time of COVID, where a lot of people and a lot of impacted communities can't do digital work because their work can't be digital, whereas other communities that can do digital work or just transition quickly to it. And then anything we expected to hear but didn't hear was we really expected to hear more about community engagement itself and connecting with the public, especially again during COVID, than was presented. And the next steps, we really identified that we need strong project or program champions to keep the work and the research going forward. So people in SCAG and the cities and the other levels of government and elsewhere to carry that torch and make sure they're pushing for the concerns. And also that we need to take a comprehensive view of the entire transportation system to ensure that it is working for everyone and for the more modes, and especially as we continue to build different stuff out.
Thank you, Marvin. And then really quick, our last group, you have about 1 minute if you can.
I'll try to be real quick. So what we didn't know was the psychology of congestion pricing and who gets to access it and all the weeds into it. Another thing was that the nexus of issues that have come together with public transit and COVID and the disparities and social justice, everything coming together gives us a different holistic view of the whole situation and the political climate and everything. We wish we would have heard a little more elaboration on from a public transit point of view, how to accomplish some of the issues that we have using the resources that we have. And another thing is that we need to get a little more immersed into the community to see really what are the key issues there and how can we fix those, and how can we implement equity and economic sustainability to improve our facilities for helping these disadvantaged communities. And lastly, a couple of things that were meshed together in the last one, connecting to the right people with the right conversation, right? Getting people in from the community groups to service providers, researchers, to politicos. How can we get everyone together into a conversation to approach this problem? And making sure that everyone is part of this decision process and that the right attention needs to be diverted to the right places.
All right. Thank you, Danny. Again, I would like to thank our speakers for coming today. It was a really full conversation. Again, I think we need to look at this topic again in the future to, I don't know, delve in further. It's so rich with lots of information.
Hey, Dr. Collins, if I could just in 10 seconds, for Danny and others, because the psychology thing we could do an hour on. I just wanted to put out there, Danny and another group of students, they want to do another hour with me and we can delve into the psychology and talk that through. I'm happy to volunteer that time with them. I know there's so much they want to talk about.
Sure, that would be great. We'll work on putting that together. And again, thanks our speakers. Thanks to all of you for coming. And again, Matt, thanks for all of the offers. We're going to be taking you up on them. Particularly, I'm hoping that we can get everybody out to TRB one day soon. With that, have a wonderful rest of your Tuesday, and we'll see you at our next dialogue in December. We look at entrepreneurism in the transportation sector as it pertains to the Inland Empire. Again, thanks and see you later.